These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcast service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, of Black Studies and Black Study, the function of futurity in Africana studies. Africa World Now Project is next. If you listen to Africa World Now Project regularly or occasionally, you will notice a consistent line of thinking, an intentionality in programming that attempts to push our thinking and imagination in order to promote a sense of connectedness by centering and mapping an Africana past, present, and future. We are intent to develop a form of thinking black out loud that attempts to contribute to the long tradition of Africana disruptive praxis, not simply as intellectual posturing or elitist academic musings, but as an evolutionary project, a practice to invoke ancestral approval and situate every word, every thought, every conversation in the traditions that Africana peoples have engaged in throughout history. Put another way, we are consistently occupied with mapping an African ancient past through an intentional commitment to move toward an African future, to see through and beyond struggle. This practice is not new. Africana peoples have engaged in a particular form and function of knowledge production, active knowledge production, in, around, outside, and in spite of academia for centuries. Always together, in community, in commons. Often and always creating intentionally and unintentionally a maroon space and undercommons. Africana ways of knowing are more systems than institutions, especially institutions as conceptualized by Western European ways of knowing. Nevertheless, the Africana being cannot fit into such limited conceptualizations of institutions. This is not to say institutions are not important, as systems often produce institutions. But this is why tradition, or more exactly traditions, often serve as the appropriate descriptor of the Black experience. And the propensity to use this descriptor indicates the presence of an identifiable genealogy, while leaving room for evolution. Africana ways of knowing are rooted in a holistic episteme of evolutionary practices that create and recreate the conditions within which Africana peoples find themselves as needed, but always impacting at a molecular level anything it interacts with. Accordingly, it was the vibrations of the assertion of an Africana humanity that pulsated in the activities of students and academic allies to push university curriculums to teach the histories, cultures, and intellectual strivings of Africa and people of African descent who were occupying those spaces. These vibrations were reverberations of larger struggles and symbiotically related to the assertion of an Africana humanity that was being waged apart from the university. There are many sources that explore this push into the academy. Professor Abdullah Kalimat has just published two, from my perspective, interdependent treatments of this history. One titled The History of Black Studies, and the other, Dialectics of Liberation, the African Liberation Support Movement. Nevertheless, we are at a point yet again that the forms and functions of Black studies are being assessed. On one level of assessment, its institutional expression as interjected in the Western Academy has produced a feedback loop that is part and parcel of a blind allegiance to disciplinarity, while on another more subtle level, the assessment is rooted in the ancestral and historical mandate at the center of Black studies, an assessment of its role and responsibility to recreating the world around us. Further exploring this evolutionary engagement with the praxis of Black thought, radical Black thought, to be specific, the unspoken but known motive is what many are beginning to recognize as Black study. This inevitable practice of engagement with the Africana experience is determined to evolve the focus of the cyclical questions. No, really, Black study is a clear and intentional disruption of these questions. In many ways, Black study asks, why are these questions still being engaged? Black study is an articulation of Du Bois' potent reflection when he wrote, "To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word." It is also important to note that for Du Bois and the long tradition of radical thinkers whom he influenced and were influenced by, understand this problem as but a local phase of a global problem. Do we need Africana studies? Or what is Black studies, or what was Black studies, highlight two important glaring observations. First, that all critiques of its form and function must be assessed and measured against Western European practices. And two, and I would argue more importantly, these questions highlight in this moment the limits that have been inculcated in the processes of knowledge production from what seemingly became a singular focus to house Black thought in white institutions. In short, Africana forms of knowing and ways of being are incompatible with this. To quote Saul Williams from Neptune Frost, "My truth is encrypted, and yours is easy to read." Nevertheless, the real question suggests that Black studies must be assessed against its origins within the praxis of Africana radical struggle outside of European constructed institutions. To engage, do we need Black studies, is essentially affirming how does it feel to be a problem. Even in its most watered down expressions, Black studies, specifically from its origins, have always pushed against Western European institutional practices and its insistence to narrowly construct and restrict knowledge production. We can see this in discourses around what is probably clear expression of liberal or neoliberal thought, such as intersectionality or critical race theory. These expressions are not inherently radical. Those who claim to be of and in the tradition of Africana studies or Black studies, who are promoted because of their abilities, in the words of Adolph Reed, to interpret the opaquely Black heart of darkness for whites, distort but cannot stop the evolution of Black studies. The seeds of evolution, the evolution of Black studies to Black study, were planted in Africana's ancient future. Futurity is innate in Africana praxis. Futurity is the twin of the past and present. They are inseparable. The seeds are indeed in the very Africana being, the very practices, conscious and unconscious behavior captured in the process of moving towards freedom, a process that Black study is aware of, and some are pouring their energy into expanding and exploring these spaces in between spaces, the extraordinary and not so extraordinary quotidian practices of Africana peoples. With this, I would like to present as a point of reflection a pivot away from the binary nature and limited forms of knowing that continually question the legitimacy of Black studies or Africana studies. Even with the discipline being firmly established in quote elite unquote institutions, are caused by an intentional and often forced divorce of the political nature of Black studies. Black studies or Africana studies departments and programs were stripped of faculty and projects that included politics, political education, and the insistence to build a sustainable bridge between the academy and community. This process led to the theoretical and epistemic removal of Africa from the Africana. Questions around what Africana studies is are dominated by what Africana studies is not. Dr. Greg Carr's meditation on this important point can be found in his article, What Black Studies Is Not, Moving from Crisis to Liberation in Intellectual Work. Not to mention, Michael Thewell argued that any attempt to discuss the question of what has come to be called Black studies or, quote, ethnic studies, unquote, as it has come to be known in specific geographical locations, that incubator of meaningless pop jargon outside of the political perspective, is futile. The demands on the part of Black students and their activist mentors were a response to the political realities of the Black community. These questions, no matter where they're being asked, are all rooted in a hermeneutic cyclical feedback loop that could be best explained in many ways through the contradictions produced and concretized from its insistence on finding legitimacy in the white imagination. More than this, the problematic in these questions is in itself rooted in a Western European time construct that is alien to indigenous forms of knowing and ways of being produced from complex forms of knowledge and ways of being that Africana people produce freely and through force. To measure progress in such a limited notion of the infinite, To attempt to build an understanding of the eternal is like counting the drops of water in the oceans by starting with counting the grains of sand on its beaches. Josh Myers suggests the same sentiment as he begins his meditation on the questions and considerations around Black studies and what you will hear next, when he states that for him, the question, do we still need Africana studies, is akin to asking, do we still need air? Today, of Black studies and Black study, the function of futurity and Africana studies. Next, you will hear Josh Myers provide a few important thoughts and many considerations around Black studies. In addition to being a member of the Africa World Now Project Collective, Josh Myers is an associate professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. He is the author of We Are Worth Fighting For, a history of the Howard University student protests of 1989, and the recently released Cedric Robinson, The Time of the Black Radical Tradition, as well as editor of A Gathering Together, literary journal. His research interests include Africana intellectual histories and traditions, Africana philosophy, musics, and foodways, as well as critical university studies and disciplinarity. His work has been published in Critical Ethnic Studies Journal, the Journal of African American Studies, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, the Human Rights and Globalization Law Review, Liberator Magazine, Global African Worker, Pambazuka, and Burning House Press, among other literary spaces. His current book project, Of Black Study, has been submitted and will soon be published with Pluto Press. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program.
Do we still need Africana studies? And so I'm going to show some images, but I'm going to mostly read. And I've titled my comments a set of questions and considerations. So if we read it together, the Black legacy at universities, do we still need Africana studies? A set of questions and considerations. It is difficult for me to answer the question, do we still need Africana studies? It is akin to asking, do we still need air? Africana studies is like breathing. And it breathes life to me, to us, for it is the foundation for knowing. Not just knowing history or current conditions, not just knowing facts and data, not just knowing Black stuff. It is the foundation for knowing. And that is the approach that I take to the project of Africana Studies. It was an approach bequeathed to me like breath to an infant, so I guard it jealously. What would knowledge be if we oriented ourselves in the ways we think to African experiences in the world across time and space? It seems to me that if we did this, we might encounter that African people have complex ways of handling life's vexing questions. What it is to be with and for each other, to truly love. What it is to be human and relate to all other forces seen and unseen. What it is to live, to die. These are considerations that are at their base the theory and method of Black study. A project of how to disrupt the conditions which make us knowing ourselves a radical prospect. Let me read that again. A project of how to disrupt the conditions which make us knowing ourselves a radical prospect. While those conditions have to be struggled against, we must not lose sight of what we are struggling for. Freedom is the lack of constraint, the lack of conditionals, the absence of the need to constantly declare one's humanity. And Black study is a freedom practice. And so you see me making a slight distinction between what scholars have been coming to call Black study, My frame on this is that Black study is this ongoing living project of creating knowledge against and for, against the conditions that prevent us from knowing ourselves, and for freedom. Africana studies or Black studies is that project within the university. And so hopefully you can see the importance of this distinction. And that is what we're actually doing in these spaces in the university is not the only place where you can do this. And in many cases, this living, ongoing project of Black study actually envelops Black people wherever they are. The difficult task for practitioners of Africana studies is to be able to tap into that in places like the university, in the classrooms, really, where we teach Black students, where we encounter Black students. We'll talk more about that in a second, but I want to make that distinction now because you'll hear me using both terms, Black study and Black studies. Black studies is in the university. Black study is in the university, but at the same time much larger than the university. It emerged out of student struggle. No one expected that students who integrated historically white academic spaces in the 1960s would attempt to overturn the central assumptions of those spaces. This righteous struggle perhaps could have been predicted had they known that these students were heir to something called the Black radical tradition. Cedric Robinson, who was in fact one of these students, called this tradition, quote, an accretion over generations of collective intelligence gathered from struggle. It called for and imagined a world where Africans could set the terms for their own lives as against the requirements of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. We were people for whom the connections between the spiritual and material world provided evidence of the essential questions of life, as well as charted ways for us to live in the future, to live again. And everything Black radicalism fought against was a disruption and negation of that knowledge, that form of life. So I'm gonna pause there for a quick second to sort of give some more context. This is Cedric Robinson. His latest text came out last year, 2019, 3 years after he made his transition. He passed away in 2016. The text that I quoted from is the other book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. And so essentially what he's saying is that every time or every moment of Black people saying no to slavery, saying no to oppression, saying no to colonialism, saying no to imperialism, saying no to somebody putting their hands on them is part of the same tradition. And you don't understand that tradition by the act that Black people engaged in. You understand that tradition by what they were engaging in that act for, to create, to imagine. And what he argues is that Black people throughout the diaspora, not just in the United States of America, throughout the diaspora, participated in actions that were geared towards reconstituting the connection between the spiritual and the material world, because that's how they understood life. Slavery was a negation of life. And so our ancestors collectively said, this can't be life. And we're going to live our best life. Which meant that we had to separate ourselves from these conditions of oppression and recreate life. The first principle of that is something called marronage or maroonage. Okay? I'm looking for chalk now because I'm improvising. All throughout the African diaspora, whether you're talking about the West Indies, whether you're talking about Latin America, whether you're talking about the continent of South America, whether you're talking about the United States, Black people created systems known as maroon communities, collectively known as marronage. societies that were distinct from the plantation, separate from the plantation, autonomous from the plantation, where black people could live their best life. And so those who escaped had somewhere to go to. I think we talk about runaways of lives, particularly in the 19th century American history, right? The Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman. And nobody ever asked, where are they going? Is the North freedom? And what happens before you could even go to the North? Because you know slavery existed there too. Did black people not run away during that period? Maroonage is the answer of where we were going. Again, autonomous societies set apart from the plantation, where black people could live on their own self-determining terms. And so when you read Cedric Robinson's work, and by the way, anytime you see a picture of a book, that means you should read the book. That's up there. I work hard putting this together so you can read these books. Don't listen to me. I mean, listen to me, but also read the books. Well, what he does in that second book, Black Marxism, is he charts many instances of black people doing this. The first instance happened in 1520-something. The last instance that he covers happens in the 1870s, 1880s. In places like Brazil, in places like Haiti, in places like Cuba, in places like Virginia, where we are now. If you go east, Africans were resisting in this state. Some of y'all are descendants of black people that said, hell nah. What does that mean? Robinson says this is a tradition. And so what happens in the 1960s is that people who were descendants of these radical Africans decided that they would create maroon spaces in Western universities. And so there's a direct connection between maroonage and black studies in the academy. And that's one of the real clear messages that I want to send today. That these spaces were created out of radical struggle. It's the only reason that they are here. There's no university administrator that decided in their infinite wisdom that black students should have these spaces. No, people who were like you, your age, in your station in life, decided that we should have black studies. How did you get the idea? There's a tradition. And traditions are passed down. We fought to get back to ourselves. It was a fight that took different forms. But it gave the generation of the 1960s the foundation to demand maroon space in the Western Academy, spaces from which to imagine what that fight would be like for our futures. They could see us then. And their wildest dreams, to use a famous meme, their wildest dreams were for our liberation. Our liberation from thinking we have to ask permission to know them. As if that kind of permission could be granted anyway. Black radicalism, rather than inclusion or diversity, was the central thrust guiding the freedom dreams of black students at the moment of the birth of Africana studies. And if we still need Africana studies, we still need the black radical tradition. Because we still need life. Everything that is happening around us in 2020 is the essential opposite of that which gives life. Racial capitalism, the most devastating human and ecological catastrophe in human history, is the very meaning of modernity. The most consequential forms of capital accumulation emerge out of a race-based system of othering and difference that eventually applied to humans of African descent. That's when they designated us as black or Negro. That is a construct that assumed that one was without. That's what Negro means. Well, without what? Robinson writes, quote, "The Negro had no civilization, no cultures, no religions, no history, no place, and finally no humanity that might command consideration, end quote. That's what that construct means. That's what it means to be erased. This is to say that we were only bodies, labor, chattel. A curious notion of Western thought is that the body and mind were split. Some of y'all read Descartes. So the African mind did not matter. Their bodies were the meaning of their humanity, or lack thereof. In her famous letter to her colleagues, Sylvia Wynter responded to the Los Angeles Rebellion of 1992 by asking, how did notions of who gets to be defined as human render black males, in particular, during the rebellion as, quote, NHI, which stood for no humans involved. This police code, they literally used this police code in the radio during the rebellion when they were encountering black men. NHI, no humans involved. This police code was part of a classificatory logic that created race and lied in, quote, the founding episteme and its rigorously elaborated disciplinary paradigms, end quote. So what Wynter is saying is that the same logic, she's talking to her colleagues. She's a philosopher at Stanford. Well, she's writing philosophy. Because the reason that they can say NHI and apply it to black people is because race is at the center of Western disciplinary practice. It starts from philosophy. It starts from Western philosophy. This categorical logic, this classificatory logic that renders some people as human and other people as not human. After all, I think, therefore I am. Well, who is I? Who gets to be an I? Who is not invited to the table? In fact, who gets to determine the not I? Because you need a not I to determine an I. So Wynter has devoted her life to working out these particular projects. Here's another book, which has her picture on it. The great Jamaican theorist Sylvia Wynter. With that philosophical project at their backs, Western society produced an immense amount of wealth, with much energy devoted to negating African humanity, which made it all possible. And as capitalism blossomed, so did the ecological disruption that attended it. The decay that we are experiencing under racial capitalism, and we can never forget the settler genocide it has also occasioned, has also produced climate change. The earth is weeping, and she is begging for her life. But we humans will die before she does. To elaborate and extend the prediction of the indigenous sage, John Hollow Horn. So the stakes for understanding the tradition of thought that animates Africana studies are truly high. We have much to say about the manifold issues that are besetting human beings in this moment. Along with climate change, we should ask how Black study interrogates questions of permanent war, the continuity of imperial adventures among capitalist countries throughout the world. We could examine the various ways notions of harm against marginalized populations mirror the antagonisms that also designated the African and Native as unhuman, as they are gendered and sexualized. We could offer ways of freeing cultural and linguistic interventions from the death grip of Western humanities and aesthetics, rendering them useful for attaining notions of beauty and truth that do not impose hierarchy and inferiority. We could posture that living together, building community and friendship, extending definitions of family might resolve the liberal propensity to atomize the individual and the attendant policy solutions based on this flawed premise. There is no space in the Western imagination untouched by the difference-making project of the West, otherwise known as racism. Undoing it is not only imperative, it will require more than alternative modernities. It would, as Walter Mignolo writes, require an alternative to modernity. And perhaps, if we listened intently to our ancestors, we could hear them saying, like W.E.B. Du Bois remarked in 1896, quote, "The Negro race has a contribution to make that only it can. End quote. That, friends, is why we need Africana studies. Having said that, of course, the question becomes how. And the question of how is where the tension lies. The grand questions that we need to resolve to ensure human survival have generated particular traditions of resistance and response. In the West, these are called ideologies. In colloquial terms, these are called our politics. What are your politics? What are my politics? What are their politics? While both terms fail to really generate useful routes to the kinds of Black radical practices that animate our tradition, they offer us some space to consider that which has been evaded in Black studies departments as we speak today. That Black studies is a how more than it is a what. It is a how we get free. This makes it inherently a threat to the university, which is an intellectual project of conservatism and the maintenance of the status quo. But our predecessors knew that. So some of them argued that the safest space to institute a true Black study was within a Black university. And no, they were not talking about HBCUs, as near and dear to my heart as they are. These calls, in fact, came from HBCUs themselves. What they meant was that the university system itself had to be abandoned and new institutions oriented to our realities created on their ashes. Howard students felt that the institution had to be recreated, even renamed Sterling Brown University, after the poet and patron saint of the Black arts movement. Just as there were students kicking in the doors at historically white universities, so too were historically Black colleges subject to the spirit of the Black student resistance. The Black radical tradition was all around them. So I have two photos here. One is from 1968. You see them renaming Howard University a Black university. The assumption, in fact, probably due to a recent Google commercial, that Howard has always been this blackly Black Wakanda kind of woke place. Betrays his own history. The students in 1968 felt it wasn't Black. Second picture is from 1989. 21 years later, it was still the case. And that's the story that I tell in my book, We Are Worth Fighting For. Okay? Actually, I have the picture up here too. So somehow, the university did not listen to the students and their really comprehensive demands in 1968. So they faced the same issue again in 1989. So what my book tells the story of is not just the protest itself, but what the meaning of the protest, what meanings lay behind the protest. And what's significant about that is the first demand of the students was not the impetus for the protest. The impetus for the protest was the university choosing a Republican strategist by the name of Lee Atwater to the Board of Trustees. For context, I don't know if y'all ever heard of Steve Bannon. Anybody? That would be like Howard choosing Steve Bannon to be in the Board of Trustees. That's how bad Lee Atwater was. He literally was responsible for George H.W. Bush becoming president through a racist campaign ad. Which also means that he was responsible for George W. Bush. Y'all know what happened in 2008, right? And so these literal, they still call them, mercenaries. Shaping public opinion. These have consequential impacts on people's lives. Somebody in here had a relative that went to the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War. God forbid somebody in here has a relative that died. But in terms of humanity, you know the scale of human suffering caused by war, unnecessary war, not just among people that we know, but people throughout the world. Millions of Iraqi people. And so it's interesting that the kernel of this is perhaps one could draw a parallel to someone like Lee Atwater. And Howard decided that they would put him on the board of trustees. The students in 1989 said, we thought we were a black university. And so they forced the university's hand. And he was removed because for 3 days, they occupied the administration building and said, we don't want Lee Atwater on our board. And the university responded by calling the cops. I won't reveal too much more about the book, but that's basically the thrust of the story. But their first demand was for Black Studies. Now, we already had a Black Studies department because of the students in 68, but what happened is that it was not being supported by the university. And so the students said, we should have Black Studies centered in the university. We were an HBCU after all. We were a Black university after all. And so they said that Black Studies must be the center of what we do at Howard University. And in that, it recalls something W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in 1933 called The Field and Function of the American Negro College. What does it mean to have a black school that is not actually starting from black experiences? It's an interesting question. And so, as that's happening at HBCUs, there's also conversation happening at HWCUs, what some people call PWIs. I don't call them that because they're historically white. So they're HWCUs. And when they surrendered and relinquished the spaces we now inhabit, the question became what to do now, how to continue, how to practice this political tradition from within the gate. What do you do now that somebody gave you a space called Africana Studies? What you do now? Women like June Jordan and Toni Cade Bambara wrote beautifully from their perch at CUNY, the City College of New York, CCNY, about what spaces needed to be cleared, what was possible in these new spaces. Their words resonate today. In her Realizing the Dream of the Black University, and this is her picture, and that's the cover of her book, her pamphlet, Toni Cade Bambara asked us to take notice of the students who have been sold a false dream. Professor Faulkner, this resonates with what we were talking about today. I didn't even know, but it was already in my presentation, and you'll hear exactly what I'm talking about. Here's a quote from Bambara. She says, "What happens to the student who is not satisfied with a surface discussion of democracy, socialism, et al. In a political science course, but wants to examine the theories in vivo, as it were? What happens to the student who is all too aware that the laws learned in an economics course do not operate in practice, for they do not take into account greed, exploitation, racism, politicking, monolithic corporations, powerful families, or individual industrial thugs? What happens to the student who wonders if the free market and free enterprise are not some easy rationale for actual inequalities in the real world? What happens to the student who spends 3 weeks learning about the Electoral College in some objective way and finally learns in 1968 that the quickest way to teach it would be to start with the observation that the Electoral College is a machine to keep the power out of the hands of the people? In short, what happens to the student who cannot or will not operate in the schizophrenic right way a good student has been trained to, with real life on one hand and academic life on the other? Some leave, and in fact, a great many of our students have thrown up their hands. Some become sleepwalkers. Shorting out is one thing we have been traditionally conditioned to do. Some can juggle skitsy business and retain some semblance of honesty and sanity, but at great costs. Some blow up, and others hope for and work for a viable alternative to the madness within these walls. It is to these latter groups that I address myself, and I'm optimistic about doing so, for they are in large numbers, and beginning to get organized and are currently infecting others with their health. Beautiful Tony Cave and bar. Infecting others with their health. I love that. But I might love June Jordan a little bit more. I'm sorry, Tony Cave. Don't make me choose. Don't make me choose. Because June Jordan says, I understand that these students come from particular families and for a particular purpose, but they also are black students too. Like you don't just lose your blackness when you become educated. Not in this world. And so what do you do in that particular moment? She says in her essay, Black Studies, Bringing Back the Person, that when we enter the gate, using this metaphor because most Ivy League institutions have these large gates to keep, the others out. But when we enter the gate, we seek community. We seek family. And, quote, Black studies. The engineer, the chemist, the teacher, the lawyer, the architect, if he is black, he cannot honorably engage career except as a black engineer, a black architect. Of course, he must master the competence, the perspectives of physics, chemistry, economics, and so forth. But he cannot honorably or realistically forsake the origins of his possible person. Or she cannot. Nor can he escape the tyranny of ignorance except as he displaces ignorance with study. Study of the impersonal, the amorality of the science, anchored by black studies. The urgency of his heart, his breath, demands the knowing of the truth about himself, the truth of black experience. And so, black students looking for the truth demand teachers least likely to lie, least likely to perpetuate the traditions of lying, lies that deface the father from the memory of the child. We request black teachers of black studies. It is not that we believe only black people can understand the black experience. It is, rather, that we acknowledge the difference between reality and criticism as the difference between the host and the parasite. End quote. That's June Jordan. And I love this picture of her. Both of those women were creative writers. Poets, novelists, short story writers. But they wrote essays that I quoted from about black studies. What does black studies have to do with a poet? And what you read, one way to answer that is what you read or what you heard, and what you read in their essays, is that they are articulating an epistemological how. An epistemological how. It's not just a political how. This is where I enter many of these conversations. So let us quickly trace this momentum. In the early days of black studies, circa late 1960s and early 1970s, there were a number of black studies conferences convened by a think tank called the Institute of the Black World. This organization was originally linked to the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolence in Atlanta, but quickly became the intellectual epicenter for black studies within the Atlanta University Center. There's a book on the Institute of the Black World. The summers featured seminars with directors of the fledgling Black Studies programs peppered all across the country. As these discussions matured, one of the key considerations became the question of what made Black studies unique. Those gathered quickly concluded that there was such a thing as a black perspective. And this was to be the foundation that Black studies will be created. One of the directors of the Institute of the Black World, Vincent Harding, that's him on the left. Next to him is Bill Strickland. I know people just saw or maybe some people did, maybe some people didn't, just saw the Who Killed Malcolm X Netflix docuseries. If you really want to understand Malcolm X, Bill Strickland's one of the authorities. The 1995 documentary on Malcolm X called Malcolm X Make It Plain. But what Harding argued was that black studies was, quote, a new land, a freedom dream like nothing we have known here in America. It is nothing we have been promised here. Black history tells us that. But it also tells us that we can build, and we begin with an entirely new understanding of ourselves and our surrounding. Black studies, Black creativity, Black hope, end quote. By mid-decade, the National Council for Black Studies was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, under the leadership of Bertha Maxwell. It quickly went to work on developing a core curriculum. And by 1980, a critical convening of Black scholars took place at Cornell University. The chair of its department, James E. Turner, collected the papers there and wrote a foreword that continues to frame the particular practices of Black studies that resonate with how I came to know this work. That's Professor Turner right there, and you see to his right, to your left, that's James Baldwin. In fact, it was Cornell University that really began the practice of using the designation of Africana studies. So that's the designation that we use here at Virginia Tech. Here's the history of that. This term was far more expansive, not just of geographical scope, but of cultural orientation. John Henry Clark's paper, this is Dr. Clark, at this conference asserted that, quote, Black is an honorable word, and I am glad to see so many people lose their fear of using it, but it has its limitations. Black or Blackness tells you how you look without telling you who you are. Africana, or Africa, relates you to land, history, and culture, end quote. Clark is one of the deans, the grandfathers, if you will, of Black studies. He comes out of a tradition in the Black South, Union Springs, Alabama, Columbus, Georgia. Somebody told him when he was a young man that the reason that we don't talk about Black history because y'all don't have no history. Somebody puts a copy of The New Negro by Alain Locke in his hand, and he turns to the page that has an essay by Arturo Schomburg called The Negro Digs Up His Past. He says, oh, we got a history. And so he hops on a train. He ain't had no ticket. He ends up in Chicago trying to get to New York. Ends up in New York, goes straight uptown to Harlem to find Mr. Schomburg. He says, I want to study African history, Mr. Schomburg. And Schomburg looked at him and says, you know, son, what you're looking for is the missing pages of European history. So study the Europeans. And from that moment on, Clark, who never got any formal training in the academy, became the dean of a group of street scholars. And they did all the work that Black studies folks, once we got into the academy, designated as the tradition. And so by the time 1968 rolls around, John Henry Clark is like the elder. And I say that because it is extremely rare today in Black studies, ironically, to hear the name John Henry Clark, despite his contribution. So I had to stop and say that. But James Turner's essay, entitled Africana Studies and Epistemology, A Discourse in the Sociology of Knowledge, argued that knowledge production carried with it a universe of meaning, and that one could not simply do Africana studies by way of the selection of a topic of study related to Black issues. Using sociology of knowledge as a way to reveal the very particular foundations of assumed objective or normative social science practices, Turner frames Black studies as, quote, a reconstruction discipline. As a synthesis of what its criticisms imply, convergence with theories reviewed, and the philosophic methods of its pedagogical emphases. If the reconstruction method is itself workable procedure, we have in Black studies a way of arriving at new theory, end quote. One had to undertake the study in Black study in a particular way. And so this essay opened up conversations about theory and methodology, how to approach these questions of what can be known with how they might be known. That's what we mean by epistemological. What can you know and how do you know it? What can be known and how can it be known? These considerations may seem abstract, but they are absolutely foundational. As situations in the coming years would prove, they are deeply consequential as well. Turner's essay asserted that Africana studies could not, quote, serve as a secondary appendage or an intellectual afterthought to another established discipline, end quote. This raised the unavoidable question of whether or not Black studies could be its own discipline. By the mid-1980s, Molefi Asante and others at Temple University were making the case for the construction of a PhD program in Africana studies. And graduate studies, of course, signified that knowledge production required disciplinarity. What made Africana studies unlike the other disciplines? Asante recalled that, quote, the only way I could justify the creation of a doctoral program was that we were teaching something that was not being taught anywhere else. This meant that those of us who worked in the department had to commit disciplined suicide from our old doctorates and work feverishly to flesh out this new discipline that was not African-American history, not African-American literature, not women's studies, not African-American sociology, and not studies in racism, end quote. And so Afrocentricity, with this methodology of centeredness, became the particular approach to Africana studies that was adopted. Quickly following on the heels of the creation of the program was the first cohort of graduate students who arrived in the fall of 1988. So it's a curious convergence between the maturity of Black studies as a PhD granting field and discipline with the study that I did on the protests of 1989. At Temple, the project of these students was clear: to advance the idea that Africana studies was a discipline and could generate reliable standards for methodologies and paradigms for study that can be passed down and replicated. This practice was what Greg Carr, in his 2011 essay, What Black Studies Is Not, called, quote, an alternative epistemology, an approach to understanding Africana experiences that sought to, quote, establish academic legitimacy to the study of African people. Terry Kershaw, who was here at Virginia Tech, helped produce much of this work. His 1992 essay, while he was still at Temple, Afrocentrism and the Afrocentric Method, is a must-read essay on this topic. And so to elevate Black study to the status of discipline, Temple students had to demonstrate the salience of that practice, perhaps using their PhD dissertations as models. In his own dissertation, Carr, a graduate of Temple, argued that dissertations, quote, must meet the dual challenge of explaining the sources of his technique while simultaneously applying and adjusting that technique in the pursuit of a research question, effectively becoming two dissertations in one, end quote. One method that his cohort inculcated is what he would call, in What Black Studies Is Not, the idea of translation and recovery. It required that scholars develop skills of, quote, intentionally linking that series of migrations, adaptations, and improvisations of African people from the origins of humanity to the present, integrating wave after wave of challenges and solutions to the problems of African human existence as a series of interlinked episodes, of which the period of enslavement and colonialism is a very recent and very temporary set of moments, end quote. From there, Africana studies might, quote, ask and answer the fundamental questions of human existence, and to leverage answers by drawing first on the most familiar sources, richest, and most accessible deep well of human experience, namely the one native to the cultural arc out of which one emerges as a human being, and as a custodian to the received inscriptions of the group as representative thinker. That's a mouthful. If y'all want to go back to that in question and answers, we can do that. This approach was given to me when I was a student at Howard, and then I was invited back to solidify that tradition, part of a department that includes 5 professors with PhDs in Africana studies, the most of any single department in the country. While Temple pioneered this work, other schools became involved in graduate study in the discipline, adopting various approaches. Many of them controversially rely on the traditional Western disciplines as a route to that academic legitimacy. This diversity of approach is thought by some to mark the maturity of the discipline. But only a conversation about the question of epistemology, knowledge production, and the forms and functions that disciplines have within the larger universe of thought will resolve the questions outlined above. This practice does not have to be equated or associated with a single paradigm or methodology, but one cannot leave unquestioned the force of Western philosophy in the architecture of the disciplines that many of us continue to be trained in. That it produces incongruities in our understanding of the world is something to be confronted, especially as those disciplines are increasingly decaying through the neoliberal behemoth in the academy and their failure to truly reveal insights that students are actually seeking. In most places, however, these contradictions are no longer raised. Africana Studies, instead, is a container for the university's diversity needs, and at best, and at worst, the space that those in power are waiting on to finally die. We still need Africana Studies, but not for many of the reasons university administrators might desire or claim. The need for Africana Studies is a question of intellectual warfare, to evoke the idea of Jacob Carruthers. For Sylvia Wynter reminds us that, quote, to move beyond the Western episteme, that is our war now. And so I'm going to move really quickly through this next part because it talks about my current book project. I have 2 current book projects. This is one of them that I'm actually writing right now. And it's basically a response to these conditions that I just outlined. And so it's called Of Black Study, Knowledge Otherwise. And it is an exploration of the way that Black intellectuals, and I choose four that we've already talked about, W.E.B. Du Bois, Cedric Robinson, Sylvia Wynter, and Jacob Carruthers. And I look at how they arrived at a critique of Western knowledge. And so ultimately, I argue that they were practicing a form of Black study that needs to at least be, at the very least, acknowledged, but probably replicated, not just in the academy, but whatever Black people are thinking and doing. Okay? Because again, Black study is a freedom practice. So I'm going to wind to a conclusion now. Even if we were all kicked out of the universities, even if there was a complete negation of these spaces, even if we were erased from the canon, the true meaning of the work would still be what it is and what it must be. The elimination of all forms of negation, the imperative to survive as free peoples, our liberation. Black study exists here because it exists outside of here. And as long as we are located in the university, we must remember the source of our work. A genealogy of thought that is both expansive and living. Of this genealogy, our genius is derivative. And so must be our methods for knowledge production and thinking and disciplinarity. This is our war now, and we will win. Thank you all for listening.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter @AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram @Africa World Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Moiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior research, content contributor, and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, content contributor and filmmaker Kurt Waterson, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and creative directors, international creative and artist designer Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.
In July, blacker than the seed in the blackberry pie, blacker than the middle of my eye.